So this is our 7th of 8 of our workforce series that we're doing on global context. And we have Jeff State's own Dr. Nicholas Ken with us today. He's the Associate Director of our Pell City campus and a biologist by trade. And he was kind enough to take some time to speak with us today. So Dr. Ken, I will turn this over to you.
Okay, so I think I'm successfully unmuted and hopefully everyone can see my screen. Thank you so much, Stacy. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to present to this group. I'm really excited to be here. And so today, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to take you through my journey through the biological sciences, the international opportunities that I've been afforded, and really just a sort of general appreciation for, the fact that different people with different backgrounds, have different perspectives. And so I want to start with this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures that I've ever taken. It's on Table Mountain in Cape Town, South Africa. And I really want to start, and I really want this quote to be the theme for this talk today. So if I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants, by Isaac Newton. And so the reason I love this is because, our knowledge as a society is additive, right? So we're constantly building and putting more and more layers. Each person will contribute something to that collective knowledge. And so anything that we discover today, anything that we figure out is really, made possible by things that we've figured out in the past. And so I want to start the journey with kind of where I came from. So I grew up in a rural farming community in Ohio. We weren't big enough to be a city, so we're a village. So it's the village of Carey. There's around 3,000 people or so. And, the time I grew up without the internet, this is probably as far from a global perspective as it gets. And sort of funny story, when I graduated high school, and I tell my students this every year during class, my parents got me a graduation gift, and I always ask, what do you think? Take a guess. What do you think I got for graduation? And inevitably students like, oh, you got a new car, you got this, you got that. No, my parents got me luggage because the idea was I was supposed to move out and go about, exploring the world, whether that's going to college, whether that's getting a job. And so, and I actually love that because the expectation was to open that next chapter. And so where I went from there, and I'm a first generation college student, so neither of my parents graduated from college, but I went to Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio, a large state institution, so around 20,000 students or so from 70 different countries. They run over 40 study abroad programs. And so coming from a small town, right, getting to this university and seeing all these different people, all these different perspectives was amazing. I loved getting that sort of college experience. And I know a lot of people on here are students, or maybe most are students, so definitely, right, take advantage of that. At Bowling Green, as Stacy mentioned, my background's in biology, so my degrees are in biology and chemistry. If you haven't been to Ohio or the Midwest specifically, the parts of Ohio at least are really this flat, right? So this is an aerial view. See if I can turn the pen on. So the campus is basically all of that land is campus for the university. And off in the distance, you can see there's a lot of farm fields. So at campus for me, there's two places I spent all of my time. So this is the math and science building, or you would find me out here on the golf course. So those were the two places you typically find me at Bowling Green. I was afforded a fantastic opportunity while at Bowling Green. So I applied and was selected to do a summer research internship at Dow AgroSciences. So Dow AgroSciences, it's a large multinational corporation. It's actually a subsidiary of Dow Chemical, but there is really where I got to use the scientific method. So I know everybody on here has been taught the scientific method, and I just put sort of the general outline, right? Observation, you form a question, you make that hypothesis, that prediction, you do an experiment, and you come to some conclusion, and then you repeat that all the time. So you may be sitting there thinking that, well, I don't really use this in my everyday life, but I would argue that you use this every day and you don't even realize it. So let me give you an example. Let's say you walk into a room, right? The room's dark. So that's your observation. The room's dark. Your question, why is it dark? Obvious hypothesis is that the light switch is off. So your experiment is to flip the light switch. Do the lights come on or not? Well, now imagine the lights don't come on. So now your observation is the light switch isn't working. Well, why? Obviously, the next step would be checking the light bulb if it burned out, right? If that didn't work, you go to diffuse box, etc. So I think all of us use this. You don't use it in a formal capacity. You obviously don't write this down, but I think we all actually use this a lot more than we think. So while at Dow, I worked with a research group that was very diverse. The main person I worked under was a German scientist. We also had a guy from Australia. And so my summer project, really simple. So what we did is the picture on the screen here, these are castor bean seedlings. So what we did is we grew these seedlings, and then we did what's called a herbicide uptake assay. And so what you would do is you would paint or put the chemical on the leaf. You then cut the stem, and you would collect the liquid over time to see, right, how long did it take the chemical to get inside and how quickly, right, or how much actually got in. And so I know that a lot of us, I'm sure, have either seen the commercial for Roundup or maybe use Roundup to kill weeds. And they always say it's rainproof in 20 minutes. Well, how do you figure that out? Right? You would do an assay like this to figure out how quickly it got in. Now, I didn't specifically work on Roundup, right? I didn't discover that, but that was kind of the backdrop to this, these experiments for the summer. And so this is really what got me excited about research and really changed my trajectory as far as my career. So from Dow, where I went to Ohio State University. So Ohio State is a huge public institution. So there's over 60,000 students at Ohio State, around 8,000 international students from over 100 countries. So, you know, most universities appreciate that diversity, right? So different people, different backgrounds, different perspectives, different ideas. And so Ohio State, I worked on my PhD. So my PhD is in biomedical sciences, and I specialize in immunology. Now, one fun fact that I actually figured out while researching for this talk is that the campus of Ohio State in Columbus, geographically, the area is actually bigger than my hometown. So the campus is larger than the hometown that I grew up, which I think is hilarious to me. So one thing that I learned at Ohio State that I think is critical to the scientific community and really society is the ability of scientists to communicate. And I think we're seeing that now, right, with COVID and just a lot of misinformation that's out there. So how do scientists typically communicate? So scientists will communicate through typically a peer-reviewed publication. A lot of you, I'm sure, have done peer review in an English class or maybe a history class. But the definition I've got here is peer review is evaluation of scientific, academic, or professional work by others working in the same field. So what's this process actually look like for a scientist? So just like we have journals or magazines for sports, maybe home and gardening, woodworking, we have journals for science, different science topics. So it could be specific, like Journal of Immunology, Journal of Neuroscience, a specific area, or it could be more broad. Science and Nature are two sort of more mainstream publications, and these will typically publish something that is a large impact. We always call it sexy. It's got to be really sexy to get something into Science or Nature, but it's supposed to be applied to a broad audience. So how this works is a research group, so we'll say a research group at Jeff State is working on a research project. They'll write up a manuscript. So that is the material and methods, right? How did they do the experiment? What did they do? Why did they do it? What are their results? What are their conclusions, right? And they're putting this out into the scientific community. So that manuscript will get submitted, okay? So the editor of the journal will look at it and he has a decision, or they have a decision. So they can outright reject, saying, well, this maybe doesn't fit with the scope of our magazine, or maybe they decide it's just not good work, right? Because the whole idea of peer review is to make sure that things that are published are of a certain quality, right? The conclusions are correct, the right controls were done, so that we can believe the information that, right, we're adding to the collective knowledge. If the editor does accept it for review, they then send that out to 2 to 3 peer reviewers. So let's say the paper is on vaccine design, right? So then they would send that manuscript out to 2 to 3 professors or 2 to 3 people working in the area of vaccine, right? Within the same area or very similar. They will then read and critique that article. They will send their reports back and the editor looks at them, and there's basically 3 decisions that can be made. So 1, the manuscript could be outright rejected. So maybe the controls weren't done, it's of poor quality, they can outright reject. Alternatively, they could accept and publish as is. So this is fantastic, it's perfect, the scientific community needs to see it, they publish it. Or, and what's more typical, is the manuscript is good, they liked it, but they have a few more questions. And so we say that it needs some revisions. You know, the whole idea of this process, right, is to publish the best paper possible. And so they'll have suggestions, it goes back, that research lab would then reply to those critiques, whether it is to rewrite something, it might be to do another experiment. Once the revisions have been made, they send it back, and then that sort of final decision is to, okay, you answered them, we're going to accept and publish, or maybe you didn't answer it correctly, and then we're going to reject, and we think you need to continue working. So that's the kind of the overall peer review for a typical journal. I'll tell you, going through this process can be excruciating because you've been working on a research project for a year, maybe 2 years. It's your baby, right? So you are invested in this project, and then you've got to have some thick skin as those reviews come back and someone is critiquing it. But you have to remember, right? These are peers, these are people working in the area, right? The comments aren't meant to be malicious. They're meant to make this publication even better. And in every case that I've had experience with, it always does. The paper gets better. So when I was preparing for this talk and when Stacy asked me to kind of give a global perspective in the biological sciences, I thought, wow, so what can I offer in a global setting? And so what I did is, when thinking of the peer-reviewed, I went to Google Scholar, and I've published 8 peer-reviewed research articles, okay? So I went to Google Scholar, and it'll show you every time that your article's been cited. And so I was pleasantly surprised that I've been cited 600 times. I thought, wow, that's fantastic. Now, don't get me wrong, it's all relative. I worked for a professor at UAB, Dr. Carey. He's been cited 25,000 times. And Dr. James Allison, who won the Nobel for some work on co-stimulatory molecules a few years ago, he's been cited 95,000 times. So, right, it's all relative, but I'm still super happy with the 600. But what I did is I clicked on some of those citations, and I asked the question, well, where are these groups coming from, right? Who's read the article and who cited it? And I was sort of blown away. So the little dot that I guess it's not little, the red dot that I put on the map, it's basically Ohio, right? So it's where I'm from and where I went to college. And then what I've done is I've drawn a line to every state or country that has actually cited one of the articles. And so I think it really illustrates that, and again, these 8 papers, right, I didn't cure cancer, but it just kind of shows the sort of global context, right? So this is why we communicate, so that someone in Australia can read some work that I've done, and they can then continue pushing the research on, or whatever country that's actually seen and looked at that data. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Okay, so from Ohio State, I went down to the University of Alabama at Birmingham, so UAB. That's how I made it to Alabama. And I did my postdoctoral fellowship there. So if you're not familiar, a postdoctoral fellowship is very similar to a medical doctor's residency. But for a PhD, we call it a postdoc. And so a postdoc, you basically work under a professor, right? You continue getting training. And one thing that I think is both really important, but also fairly common in the biomedical research area, is the idea that you should get training in different areas from different people. So it's definitely recommended, right, to go to different universities to do your training. Had I stayed at Ohio State or stayed at Bowling Green, right, you would work with a lot of the same people, a lot of the same ideas. So as you move to different locations, right, you interact with new people, you interact and you get sort of different perspective. You know, UAB is a world-class research institution. We constantly had lectures from professors or researchers from all over the world. Again, UAB recognizing, right, that collective knowledge and bringing in different people with different perspectives. So I was really, really fortunate while at UAB to actually go to the RIKEN Institute, their Center for Allergy and Immunology in Yokohama, Japan. So if you see, I'll point myself. So I'm this young guy here in the middle without all the gray in my beard now. So fantastic opportunities. So 39 researchers were selected, 17 different countries. We all went to Yokohama, Japan for 2 weeks. We gave talks on our research. We attended workshops. We went to an international meeting, right? Lots of networking, definitely a greater appreciation for the Japanese culture. But you know, scientists from all over the world coming in, sharing ideas, again, that whole collective knowledge. Sort of a quick story about this. So I was in the lab at UAB. We had 12 or 15 people there. And this announcement comes out that there's this 2-week opportunity, it's all expenses paid to go to Japan. And so of course, everyone in the lab wants to go. So fairly simple, an application, your CV, an essay on your research, and an essay on why you want to go. And so everyone's applying, everybody wants to go. We apply, and a couple weeks later, I get an email, and congratulations, Dr. Ken, you got selected. So of course, I'm over the moon, right? I get to go interact with all of these other scientists. And then I realized, wow, they're only picking a few people, so there's no way they're picking anyone else from my lab, right? And so I wait a couple days, and I kind of feel bad that, you know, I'm guessing no one else got selected. So finally, I tell the group, it turned out no one else applied, which is crazy. So again, all the students, you know, on here today, one of the mottos I live by is you got to be in it to win it, right? So you got to apply. I mean, I can guarantee no one else in the lab was going to get picked because no one else actually applied. So that's my motivational speech for the day. So another opportunity that came up while I was at UAB, NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, partnered with the International AIDS Society. And so they created this scholarship program where they wanted to bring investigators who don't work in HIV/AIDS into the field, right? So they were trying to cure the disease, come up with a vaccine, different treatments, and they wanted to bring new people, new ideas. And so I was very fortunate to be selected 21 different researchers from 10 different countries were selected. We went to Cape Town. I got to take that beautiful picture that I started with. And the same thing, we had workshops. We all gave talks. We all attended the conference. So we all got to sit around, right, sharing ideas, sharing different perspectives from our areas as well as that of HIV and AIDS. Really interesting and a really eye-opening experience. We got to go out and visit one of the HIV and the tuberculosis medical facilities where they actually treat there outside of Cape Town. And it's a very complex issue. We could do a whole talk on the different social and cultural differences when we're treating someone with HIV/AIDS. There's a lot of different things to think about. And I think, we need to think in a global context, right? A way that we may treat someone here in the United States, right, versus South Africa versus somewhere else in the world is very, very different. But I appreciate that the NIH as well as the IAS, right, they recognize this, right, and they're trying to continue to bring in, and there are people from all over the world. So from UAB, I then transitioned to Jeff State. And so I'm currently an associate dean and a biology instructor here. I love being at Jeff State. It may seem like an interesting transition coming from kind of the research background. My first experience with Jeff State was to teach part-time at night while I was still doing research at UAB. And I just fell in love with the teaching, with the students. Being a first generation myself, I think I can relate with the students. I think I make a difference and have a lot to offer. I understand where the students are coming from. But with that said, I definitely didn't leave the research behind. So we have been fortunate enough at Jeff State to have an NIH-sponsored Bridges to the Baccalaureate grant. So this Bridges grant, we're the only one in the state of Alabama and one of around 40 in the country. But what this grant does is it gives community college students the opportunity to do a summer research internship at UAB. It's a paid position, so students don't have to worry about working. They can have that experience. And the goal is to graduate from Jeff State, right, transfer to any 4-year, and then get a bachelor's degree in some area of biomedical sciences. Been a fantastic opportunity. We're in our 7th year. We graduate around 90%. So I think that the program has been really, really successful. I've got and I feel like they're my kids now. Each year I have a group of students come through, but it's great to see students have this opportunity, like take advantage of the opportunity and then get exposed to so many things at UAB and so many opportunities that are out there. So here at Jeff State, we have an active international presence and program. And I know that everyone on here already knows how fabulous Stacy Thompson is, but I will say the majority of anything international going on at Jeff State is because of Stacy. So she is fantastic. We have not hosted any Fulbright Scholar in residence at Jeff State, but what we have done is take advantage of the Outreach Lecturing Fund, so the OLF. So these awards are there to provide support to bring a Fulbright who's at another university in the United States, right? Bring them to Jeff State, let them talk to students, right? Have lunch with faculty or the students. Promoting a cultural understanding, promoting, their academic discipline. We've, over the past couple years, been fortunate enough. We've brought researchers from Costa Rica, Nigeria, Pakistan, Ireland. So think of all of those different cultures coming to Jeff State and students being able to be exposed. So it's been a tremendous opportunity for students, for faculty and staff. It's been great to interact and kind of, gain a greater appreciation for those different areas. So when we think about, biological sciences and that global perspective, obviously COVID-19 is an easy example to give. These are global problems and it requires a global approach. Similarly with climate change, or CRISPR-Cas9. And so I'm not sure how much you've seen CRISPR-Cas9 technology in the news. So sort of briefly, this is just a technology that can be used to specifically alter DNA within a living cell. So it can cut DNA and replace, let's say, replace a mutation for a particular disease, or change the DNA in some way. Now,
Is that
obviously,
is that the same as RNA things that they use to create some of the vaccines?
yeah, so CRISPR uses RNA to target a DNA strand. And it's a way that you can then cut out and insert a different strand of DNA. But yes, it does use RNA. The Cas9 is a nuclease, just meaning that it cuts DNA. Where you probably would have seen it in the news a few years ago, there was actually a Chinese scientist who altered the DNA of an embryo. It was actually twins. He changed a specific sequence of DNA to change one of their cell receptors. It was supposed to make them resistant to HIV infection. Now, there's a lot of ethical implications. That scientist actually is currently in jail for not going through the proper protocols, because that's obviously never been done. And we could talk about that for a while on should it ever be done. But I think those conversations need to happen, right? Those need to happen on a global scale. All right, and finally, I'm going to end with this slide that we started with. So, if I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants. And again, love the quote, this idea of constantly adding more and more information. And so I will stop there, and I would love to have a conversation or answer any questions you might have.
Feel free to unmute, or if you can't talk, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'll be happy to transfer the question as usual. Oh, any typing going on?
I've got a question. Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I was a bit late today. Dr. Kin, I'm really curious. I know it's a complex answer or a complex question, but I'm really curious about what qualities in yourself in hindsight or retrospect, what qualities about yourself do you think were most valuable in working with and learning about communities that were different from your own while you were involved in an applied program of working with communities? And I'm really curious because sometimes that's something we don't realize about ourselves. And I think if we're conscious about the importance of those qualities, that's something that we can cultivate in our lives so that we're more prepared even to do the work when it comes to us, that opportunity. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, I think that is a great question and a great, point. I think for myself, having a science background, I've always been, extremely curious and sort of inquisitive by nature. And so I know that growing up in a rural farming community where 99.9% of our high school was white, I think it was eye-opening to go to college, but just that inquisitive and curious nature is really what drove me to just understand and to gain more information and knowledge about different people, different cultures. I also love to travel. There's not a place in the world that I wouldn't want to visit. And I definitely am not the typical tourist, which I'm guessing a lot of you on the call aren't either, as far as, I really want to learn about the place, learn about their history, learn about their cultures, and experience it while I'm there, not go to the tourist site and take a picture and go home. So, but I think that That's a great question, and I would, I think, kind of lean that way.
Thank you.
What
That's
else?
a wonderful answer. Curiosity is a wonderful thing.
Others? You have carte blanche here, y'all use it.
Hi, this is Kiara. I'm still trying to formulate the question, so maybe talking about it might help. You mentioned about going around having different perspectives. What about I have met academics who stayed at their university from undergraduate to master's to getting their doctorate. How does that compare to someone like you who took advantage of all the opportunities and all that? I mean, I'm sure they had their own journeys and took advantages of opportunities, but their their degrees came from one place, whereas yours came from different places and different perspectives.
Sure. So I think first of all, it's definitely difficult with family constraints a lot of times for people to move around to different universities. But I think, for example, we're all on Zoom right now, so I think you really can interact so much more with people all over the world, even if you are at your one specific university. I think universities also typically do a really good job of bringing in speakers from the outside. And so, my personal preference would be for people to move around a little bit more for their degrees, especially. But I think in today's day and age, it may not be as much of a requirement, just because we are so much more global between different people, different universities. But great point.
Thank you. I agree.
I had a curiosity question myself. In the context of your learning, you talked about, I mean, you could see from some of the pictures you showed, you worked with multicultural labs and, and other professionals that were of different backgrounds. How did that impact your working environment when you were doing research? On the approaches, the communications, were there challenges with that? Were there positives, negatives?
Great question. So, I think anytime different cultures are interacting, depending on how familiar you are, there's definitely challenges. I think I haven't really had any poor experiences. I think in the research setting, it's very common to have people from all different countries come into the labs. And so I think everyone's really been open and receptive. And it's really just having that conversation at the workplace while you're doing your work. And so it's definitely I think a good setting, I'll say. I haven't had issues with that specifically, but I think it really depends on the environment of that university that you're at, and also importantly the environment of that lab that you're working in, right? So that working environment can cultivate sort of partnerships or not. And so I know I kind of danced around that a little bit, Stacy, but good question.
Any other questions amongst the group? So I am going to thank you so much for coming, Dr. Ken. I am going to stop the recording now.